Assalamu alaikum and good morning to everyone. I hope everyone had a restful evening yesterday. Um, Today we have the pleasure of a keynote with Dr. Curtis Scott Jacobs. I think many of you here have met him yesterday for the great personality that he is. But for those who may be joining us online, if I may speak a bit about Dr. Jacobs, he is a professor of communication at the University of Illinois. And a well-known argumentation, communication, and rhetorical scholar. Dr. Jacobs takes special interest in argumentation and discourse theory, conflict management, conversational interaction, especially as found in natural speech or speech acts of conversational argument and debate. In the last few months, Dr. Jacobs has contributed to the ADA project with an expert consultation where he has kind of helped us formulate a better understanding of the truth status of propositions of debate processes and also how we might be better able to develop a new deliberative debate model based on the Munadara tradition. In our last session yesterday, Dr. Jacobs spoke to us a bit about the public policy debate process in America and his own experiences in his own classroom. And today he will be speaking about the model of procedural rationality in academic debate. Dr. Jacobs will have the floor for his keynote for about 40 minutes, and after which we will be taking questions both in the room and also online. So if you're joining us on YouTube, please feel free to send your questions in the YouTube chat box, and we will address them during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Jacobs. Welcome.
Thank you. I want to talk. Oh, okay. How do I turn this on? Left one? No. Out of juice. That's okay, I can use this. Today I want to talk some more about the debate tradition in American communication studies. And I want to move towards a, is this working now? Okay. And I want to talk about it at a more general theoretical level. Specifically, I want to talk somewhat about the history of the development of policy debate in America. And I want to suggest that we can look at it not just from a practical point of view, but look at the practical issues as informing a theoretical model of what is procedural rationality in argumentation. You can look at problems that intuitively emerged over the course of the last century or so of debate, and you can see that the reason they're problems is because of the way that they relate to the norms that are actually underlying debate. And the same thing goes with the ways in which coaches over the years changed the practice of debate. All of this is sort of implicit, tacit knowledge. Nobody writes about this stuff. I only discovered it by going back and looking at textbook after textbook from 1895 on. There are a lot of them. But out of that develops a kind of consensus model that I'm going to call the debate model by about 1970, 75. Now, I don't want you to think that this model applies only to academic contest debating. It applies to all argument. And the way you can see that is by looking at the only example of genuine debate I have ever seen in an American presidential debate. Everything else is just fought debate. This occurred during the Democratic presidential primaries back in 2008. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama old debaters, by the way, and they hijack the format from the moderator, and this is what debate is supposed to look like. Oops, we're not getting sound. Is there any way to get sound? Oh, and while they're looking at that, if you ever thought that women can't debate, they were noticeably absent in American debate for decades, or at least underrepresented. Just watch Hillary Clinton and listen to our other colleagues.
Got a good healthcare plan. Have a good healthcare plan, I think. Is similar. I have endured over the course of
They're talking
in Iowa, in Nevada, and other places, suggesting that I want to leave 15 million people out. According to Senator Clinton, that is accurate. I dispute it, and I think it is inaccurate. On the other hand, I don't Senator Clinton for wanting to point out what she thinks is an advantage to her plan. The reason she thinks that there are more people covered under her plan than mine is because of a mandate. That is not a mandate for the government to provide coverage to everybody. It is a mandate that every individual purchase health care. And the mailing that we put out accurately indicates that the main difference between Senator Clinton's plan and mine is the fact that she would force, in some fashion, individuals. If it was not affordable, she would still presumably force them to have it unless there is a hardship exemption, as they've done in Massachusetts, which leaves 20% of the uninsured out. And if that's the fact, her has not indicated how she would enforce this mandate. She hasn't indicated what level of subsidy she would provide to assure that it was in fact affordable. And so it is entirely legitimate for us to point out these differences. But I think it's very important to understand the context of this, and that is that Senator Clinton has, her campaign at least, has constantly sent out negative attacks on us, email, robocalls, flyers, television ads, radio calls. And, you know, we haven't whined about it because I understand that's the nature of these campaigns. But to suggest somehow that our mailing is somehow different from the kinds of approaches that Senator Clinton has taken throughout this campaign, I think is simply not accurate.
And Senator Clinton, on this subject.
I have to respond to that because this is not just any issue, and certainly we've had a vigorous back and forth on both sides of our campaign, but this is an issue that goes to the heart of whether or not this country will finally do what is right, and that is to provide quality, affordable health care to every single person. Senator Obama has a mandate in his plan. It's a mandate on parents to provide health insurance for their children. That's about 150 million people who would be required to do that. The difference between Senator Obama and myself is that I know the work I've done on health care for many years, that if everyone's not in the system, we will continue to let the insurance companies do what's called cherry picking, pick those who get insurance and leave others out. We will continue to have a hidden tax so that when someone goes to the emergency room without insurance, 15 million or however many, that amount of money that will be used to take care of that person will be then spread among all the rest of us. And most importantly, you know, the kind of attack on my health care plan, which the University of Pennsylvania and others have said is misleading, that attack goes right to the heart of whether or not we will be able to achieve universal health care. That's a core Democratic Party value. It's something that ever since Harry Truman, we have stood for. And what I find regrettable is that in Senator Obama's mailing that he has sent out across Ohio, it is almost as though the health insurance companies and the Republicans wrote it. Because in my plan, there is enough money, according to the independent experts who've evaluated it, to provide the kind of subsidies so that everyone would be able to afford it. It is not the same as a single state trying to do this, because the federal government has many more resources at its disposal. So I think it's imperative that we stand as Democrats for universal health care. I've staked out a claim for that. Senator Edwards did, others have, but Senator Obama has not.
Senator Obama, quick response.
Well, look, I believe in universal health care, as does Senator Clinton. And this is I think, the point of the debate, is that Senator Clinton repeatedly claims that I don't stand for universal health care. And for Senator Clinton to say that, I think, is simply not accurate. Every expert has said that anybody who wants health care under my plan will be able to obtain it. President Clinton's own Secretary of Labor has said that my plan does more to reduce costs, and as a consequence, make sure that the people who need health care right now, all across Ohio, all across Texas, Rhode Island, Vermont, all across America, will be able to obtain it. And we do more to reduce costs than any other plan that's been out there. Now, I have no objection to Senator Clinton thinking that her approach is superior, but the fact of the matter is that if, as we've heard tonight, we still don't know how Senator Clinton intends to enforce a mandate, and if we don't know the level of subsidies that she's going to provide, then you can have a situation, which we're seeing right now in the state of Massachusetts, where people are being fined for not having purchased health care, but choose to accept the fine because they still can't afford it, even with the subsidies. And they are then worse off. They then have no health care and are paying a fine above and beyond that. That is a genuine difference between myself and Senator Clinton. And the last point I would make is the insurance companies actually are happy to have a mandate. The insurance companies don't mind making sure that everybody has to purchase their product. That's not something they're objecting to. The question is, are we going to make sure that it is affordable for everybody? And that's my goal when I'm president of the United States.
Senator, as you
wait
two...
a minute, I've got, this is too important. You know, Senator Obama has a mandate. He would enforce the mandate by requiring parents to buy insurance for their children. That is the case. If you have a mandate, it has to be enforceable. So there's no difference here. It's just that I know that parents who get sick have terrible consequences for their children. So you can insure the children, and then you've got the breadwinner who can't afford health insurance or doesn't have it for him or herself. And in fact, it would be as though Franklin Roosevelt said, let's make Social Security voluntary. Let's let everybody get in it if they can afford it. Or President Johnson said, let's make Medicare voluntary. What we have said is that at the point of employment, at the point of contact with various government agencies, we would have people signed up. It's like when you get a 401k at your employer, the employer automatically enrolls you. You would be enrolled. And under my plan, it is affordable because, number one, we have enough money in our plan. A comparison of the plans like the ones we're proposing found that actually I would cover nearly everybody at a much lower cost than Senator Obama's plan, because we would not only provide these healthcare tax credits, but I would limit the amount of money that anyone ever has to pay for a premium to a low percentage of your income. So it will be affordable. Now, if you want to say that we shouldn't try to get everyone into health insurance, that's a big difference, because I believe if we don't have universal health care, we will never provide prevention. I have the most aggressive measures to reduce costs and improve quality. And time again, people who have compared our two approaches have concluded that.
Brian,
so let's have a debate about the facts.
The last answer on this topic.
It is just not accurate to say that Senator Clinton does more to control costs than mine. That is not the case. There are many experts who've concluded that she does not. I do provide a mandate for children because, number one, we have created a number of programs in which we can have greater assurance that those children will be covered at an affordable price. Of many adults, we don't want to put in a situation in which on the front end we are mandating them, forcing them to purchase, and if the subsidies are inadequate, the burden is on them and they will be penalized. And that is what Senator Clinton's plan does. Now, I am happy to have a discussion with Senator Clinton about how we can both achieve the goal of universal health care. What I do not accept and which is what Senator Clinton has consistently done. And in fact, the same experts she cites basically say there's no real difference between our plans, that they are not substantial. But it has to do with how we are going to achieve universal health care. That is an area where I believe that if we make it affordable, people will purchase it. In fact, Medicare Part B is not mandated, it is voluntary, and yet people over 65 choose to purchase it, Hillary. And the reason they choose to purchase it is because it's a good deal. And if people in Cleveland or anywhere in Ohio end up seeing a plan that is affordable for them, I promise you they are snatching it up because they are desperate to get health care, and that's what I intend to provide as
Senator,
president.
I'm going to change the
About
subject.
20% of the people who are uninsured have the means to buy insurance. They're often young people who think they're immortal.
Which is why I
except
cover
when the illness or the accident strikes. And what Senator Obama has said, that then once you get to the hospital, you'll be forced to buy insurance. I don't think that's a good idea. We ought to plan for it, and we ought to make sure we cover everyone. That is the only way to get to universal health care coverage. That is what I've worked for 15 years, and I believe that we can achieve it. But if we don't even have a plan to get there, and we start out by leaving people, you'll never, ever control costs, improve quality, and cover everyone.
With respect to the young people, my plan specifically says that up until the age of 25, you will be able to be covered under your parents' insurance plan. So that cohort that Senator Clinton is talking about will, in fact, have coverage.
It requires substantial background information. I mean, you have to know something like, for example, Mitt Romney's universal health care plan for the state of Massachusetts, which I might point out he refused to defend when he ran as president, and was ultimately the basis for both Obama and Clinton's plan. You've got to know about that. You got to know about what the mandate is all about. You got to know what Medicare is. All this background knowledge is there, and that's just the way debate works. The second thing you might have noticed is if you don't have a flow sheet, even that is hard to follow. There really is a kind of technological advantage to writing it down and flowing it out. Well, academic policy debate today, said last time, is around general policy propositions like, should the United States adopt universal health care? It involves two sides. Each side in academic policy debate consists of two-person teams, although you could reduce it to one-person teams. I see no reason not to, other than the two-person team lets more people debate. And importantly, in academic policy debate, the teams switch sides. They are not advocates in the traditional rhetorical sense. And you have these regularly held multiple team tournaments over the course of a year. And by the end of the year, debaters have a pretty good idea, not only of what the issues are, but who's right and wrong. You've got this standard kind of format that has been developed over a period of 125 years. It started out in the 1890s as Lincoln-Douglas types of debates, off of the model of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates for the for the senator to the state of Illinois in 1858. They were long speeches by both sides, followed up by a short rebuttal by the first speaker. And now we've got this long thing. And you got to ask why. What led to this? This didn't just happen out of practical considerations. It happened because coaches over the years came to the conclusion that this created a more rational kind of argumentation. So I want to talk about that debate tradition and the kind of theory that emerged in the formation of this kind of pattern of academic policy debate. This is a long-standing tradition of scholarship and pedagogical practice, largely in the field of communication. It was in fact central to the emergence of departments of what at that time were called speech departments in the United States, not communication departments. Speech departments emerged at the turn of the century, largely in response to student demand for debate training. Now, it all began with intercollegiate debate contests in the 1870s and 1880s. Those were organized by students and student literary clubs. And it spread across the United States in the 1890s. There's nothing that gets students more involved than intercollegiate competition. Oh yeah, we're better than you guys. And by the 1920s, departments of speech and speech communication had already taken over the debate programs, started offering courses, paying for coaches, paying for travel, and you get these multi-team invitational tournaments. And that creates a whole set of practical constraints, like how do you get a whole bunch of teams debating positively in a short weekend period? Well, the answer is that format that I was talking about. Interestingly, though, the debate tradition has been largely ignored by contemporary argumentation scholars. And I hope that the people here have sympathy for forgotten and ignored traditions that should not have been. And the reason is it was largely eclipsed in communication departments by rhetorical scholarship. Rhetoric was the lever that speech departments used to justify their academic independence from English departments, not debate. And it's interesting that rhetoric eclipsed debate as a mode of theorizing about argumentation, because virtually every faculty member in every department in speech communication was either a debater or a coach, and they all judged debates. I was, and still am, shocked to talk to rhetorical scholars who themselves were famous debaters in college, famous coaches in college, about the principles of debate, and they just look at me like, what is this? They had to learn it to do it, but they don't think of it as a theoretical set of principles. They think of it more as arcane conventions required to get debaters to debate within this 8-minute and then 4-minute back and forth format. The first systematic articulation of debate models was Alden, who was a Harvard coach of the debate team there. He wrote in 1900 the Art of Debate, and you can see where the debate model shows up. It's a chapter called Burden of Proof, where we have ideas of proof, presumption, and then shifts in the burden, and he starts talking about rebuttals and extension. This was later refashioned by James O'Neill in 1917 when he took Laycock and Scales's book, Argumentation and Debate, which actually had nothing about debate per se, and he refashioned it. I guess, the professor said, well, yeah, we'd like to sell this book again. Why don't you have a go at it, James? And he did. He later became the department head at the University of Wisconsin. Here's his book, and you'll see chapter 3, an outline on the burden of proof, where he starts laying out this theory of debate. Now, that contrasts with Baker's book, which is widely said to be the first book on debate, called The Elements of Argumentation. He was a debate coach at Harvard also. He got, when he stepped down, because coaching is just too much work, Alden took over. But if you look at that book, you won't find anything about debate in it. There's the entire table of contents, not a word about it. What Baker thought debate was effectively the Lincoln-Douglas model, where the affirmative gets up there with a canned speech and the negative goes up with their own canned speech, which they could give never having heard that affirmative speech. And then, well, yeah, you get a summary closing, but it's not really debate. Interestingly, Baker rewrote his book with Huntington. He still took first authorship, though, unlike O'Neill, who got first authorship. And there he has a chapter at the end on debate, and it's based off of Alden's book. Now, the logic of debate, as I said last time, is one where the function is not resolution, it's not persuasion, agreement. It is simply the extension of arguments to the point of exhaustion. It's a little bit like if you think of a speech act analysis of what is an argument. The illocutionary force of an argument is justification. The perlocutionary effect may be persuasion, but it could be many other things as well. And when you think of debate and its function, you can see this extension of argument to the point of exhaustion. That may have the effect of creating resolution. It may have the effect of creating persuasion, but that's not a necessary connection. And you see debate coaches coming to this by the kind of debates and theoretical issues that start popping up in both the textbooks and sometimes the journal. Very early on, you have debates about, is the point of debate conviction or persuasion? And the early ones who are rhetorically inclined say, well, it ought to be a balance of both. By the end of the 1960s, nobody's talking about persuasion anymore. The function of debate is conviction. It's truth testing. You see it in arguments about whether or not it's ethical to have two-sided debates. And the alternative seems to be, well, you should advocate that for which you sincerely believe. Again, that rhetorical position, they lost. Two-sided debate was the point, to inculcate this attitude of understanding both sides is the best way to knowledge. You see it also in the 1930s, in 1940s with these books and articles on the difference between discussion and debate. Yeah, we recognize that these days on the difference between adversarial and non-adversarial argumentation. This stuff gets rehashed over and over again throughout history. Well, debate won, although there's a place for discussions as well. And finally, you see it in the way in which judges change in their role and the way that they fill out ballots. very early on, because of the practical demands of tournament debating, you can't have audiences. You got to just get one guy in there to make a decision, and that's the expert judge. And the expert judge is not supposed to judge in terms of being persuaded. From the very beginning, they're supposed to be objective. And by the time you get into the 1960s, 1970s, they're making basically two judgments. They're making a judgment on the ballot about the oratorical skills of the debaters. Those are speaker points. And who won the debate. Now, this whole idea, I think, behind this idea of extension comes from the increasing refinement of the obligations of debaters to follow this kind of line that I showed you before. In early debating, the second affirmative constructive could have been a completely independent speech for the affirmative proposition. Somewhere by the 1930s and 40s, this sort of a pattern is being enforced. The second affirmative isn't introducing new arguments, although that still continues through the 1960s from my looking at debate examples. But by the 1970s, that second affirmative is simply recovering the first affirmative. It's a rebuttal speech already. And the same thing goes with the division of duties between the negative, first and negative constructive. They're dividing between who's going to attack the rationale for change, who's going to attack the plan. And by the end, you get this picture of extension, extension, extension. And everybody recognizes that it's an arbitrary cutoff point. This could go on forever. Usually, though, with even collegiate debaters, 7 turns is enough to hit exhaustion. You'd be surprised how many are lucky to get out of constructives alive. This also, by the way, is why you need a judge. In the ideal vision of debate, you don't need a judge because the flow sheet will take care of itself. By the end, we'll have decided in terms of exhaustion. And this is also why you need flow sheets. Flow sheets, I think, were not just a technological advance, they were a conceptual advance. Because once you get legal pads, you can start to track this stuff. And you can start to enforce the rules of extension, the demand for extension. And you can start to see this picture in which what's really the procedural rationality of debate is this answer, counter, answer, counter, counter, answer, counter. How long can we go? Now, you saw this before. This is what flow sheets look like. Modern debaters use computers, although I'm an old-fashioned guy and I can't figure out how you can possibly flow fast debates with computers. Maybe you can do it. My students can't. The importance also of flowing is one of the reasons why there became this alienation by 1970 between the debate community and the rhetorical scholars who thought that they were supporting debate through their department's funds. Because all speeches, by the time you get flow sheets, are built for flow sheets. Even the first affirmative constructive, that very first speech, is one where you use bullet points to lay out your arguments and you use outline markers like reason 1, contention B, subpoint C, and things like that. And hey, you need that. because you've got to flow it to see where the arguments go. And you find that for all the subsequent speeches, debaters are looking at their flow sheet. They're reading from the flow sheet. They're telling the judge and the other debaters where they are in the flow sheet by mentioning what has been argued. Here's my response. And they're speaking for the flow sheet. So that really what this is just the oral construction of flow sheets by the time we get to the 1970s. This is not public oratory, nor is it rhetorical adaptation to a public audience in the traditional sense. Heck, Obama and Clinton weren't adapting to their audience. I mean, if the public understood that little debate, they're better than I am. But it is rhetorical adaptation in the sense that you're adapting to an expert judge who's well-versed on the issues, who is used to hearing very fast talk, and is using a flow sheet to track the arguments. So, what is the debate model? It's been developed through observation and reflection on the practice of contest debaters. It emerged by manipulating formats. We've seen all these other formats. We're still manipulating them, trying to see what works and testing our intuitions about why is this a good format? Why is that a bad one? It's our intuitions here that are being consulted. It was developed and revised in training, in debate practice. For example, Munazara would be very familiar to modern debaters who practice debate outside because of that. Put out a claim, then get the counterclaim, counterclaim, keep going to exhaustion. That's basically what you get in debate training in many of the real high-powered debate programs in America. And what you can do is you can look at contest debate as a kind of analytic laboratory. Now, coaches didn't use that term. Sometimes they used laboratory, but they didn't think of it as an analytic laboratory. They were thinking of it in terms of practical kinds of designs. But what I suggest you can do at the theoretical level is look at contest debate to see how intuitions about what is going right and what is going wrong inform what must be the principles. Because the end of treating it as an analytic laboratory is we articulate the underlying principles. And actually, those principles are pretty simple, although there are some which still, I think, are difficult to get right. Contest debate is not just an educational tool, it's a theoretical tool. That's why I went back to teaching debate. It wasn't because, I thought I was going to promote a better civic culture in America. I'm not big enough for that. It's because I wanted to observe kids debating to get some sense of what's going on there. And what I did was I started treating, like coaches do, the problems in practice as problems, but not practical problems, analytic problems, because they're problems because they reveal some underlying normative requirement for good argument. And it's an underlying requirement for good argument in the general sense. It applies not just to contest academic debate, it applies to Clinton and Obama and to anybody else who engages in interactional argument with one another. Now, the debate model, which began quite early with Alden and O'Neill, is an articulation of a set of obligations and entitlements. And if you carry out those obligations, you will allow for the systematic elaboration of the basis for decision-making in the way we want that elaboration to proceed. It's actually an argument of, or a theory of argumentative rationality in the dialectical tradition. I think of it as a pure dialectical model. It doesn't have anything to say about logic, doesn't have anything to say about rhetoric. It presupposes those sorts of things. And it's a procedural model in the sense that what it simply does is it says, here are your obligations, here are your duties. Do this, don't do that. It's an adversarial system. It's characteristically American, I think. And I think that that's probably a reflection coming not just from cultural differences, but from legal traditions. The continental legal system, I understand, is very different from the American system of adversarial argument. But you have opposing roles where you have to argue one side or the other for the sake of argument, for the sake of the system. And in that way, it serves a kind of truth-testing function. And it's a truth-testing function that is, in principle, open-ended. It's just like Charles Peirce talked about with truth, being that point at which an asymptotic curve converges with. And what it basically does is it works to force extension of disagreement to its limit, to exhaustion in the genuine sense and not just the contingent sense of we've run out of time or I need more time to think or I gotta sleep. It's actually, I think of, a way of developing argumentation theory's prime directive. Whether you're coming from a logical approach, a rhetorical approach, or a dialectical approach, I think that behind the normative vision of your theories is something like this directive. Determine the truth value of any claim at issue by determining the force of the better argument, pro and con, and the force of the better argument alone. Now, we get three very different ways of elaborating that principle. The first principle, the inferential adequacy principle, you'll recognize as logic. This is the idea that arguments ought to be evaluated in terms of their probative force, and claims ought to be evaluated in terms of the probative force of the arguments that justify or refute those claims. That's basically what logic or informal logic is up to. The situational adequacy approach is what I think of as the modern rhetorical theory of argument. And this is the idea that good arguments ought to be adjusted to the situations in which they are engaged. Good claims and arguments ought to be presented in ways that maximally satisfy the competing demands of the situation. And the demand, I suppose, of audiences is part of that. But modern rhetoric thinks of adaptation in a more broad scale way. This is the dialectical approach, and it's where the debate model fits in. It's a procedural adequacy principle, which is that claims and arguments ought to be evaluated in terms of the degree to which the procedures for testing those claims and arguments maximize full, open, careful discovery and consideration of the quality of those claims and arguments. It's actually a standard about the means of decision-making and not the ends of decision-making. And I suppose I ought to say a little bit about that principle. In some ways, I think of dialectic as addressing something like the following practical problem. If you take the logical approach, I think logic is great. Everybody ought to use it. But applying those standards to actual substantive arguments is notoriously difficult. Not just, in terms of simple things like identifying what kind of argument is that, but is it any good? Well, how good? I don't know anybody who's got those sorts of criteria worked out. Now, one way of dealing with that problem is to kick the problem upstairs. Let's let the people decide. And what we'll ask is, did they decide in a good way? It's sort of like with a jury in America. I don't know what goes on in court cases, but I do know that if the jury is presented with a good method that maximizes full, open, careful discovery and consideration of the quality of the arguments, that they probably made a good decision. You can trust them. And that's the level, I think, of dialectical modeling. How can we spell out a model which maximizes what they've got? Now, I've elaborated this model of procedural adequacy in debate with 6 principles. And you got a paper there. I'm not going to go back through it. I will make a couple of comments on what I think is unique to this model, at least the way that I've spelled it out. The first is the obligation of self-administration. This is only obliquely referenced in any of the textbooks, but it's essential to dialectics. For dialectic to work the way that it does, for debate to work the way it does, the parties themselves are responsible for holding each other accountable to all the other principles. You do see this referenced in debate textbooks by people who talk about judging standards and talk about how there is at least this puzzle, this problem, where, on the one hand, these were really bad arguments. I wouldn't have made them. I wouldn't have let them stand. On the other hand, the debaters did. So who won the debate? Well, everybody knows that technically, in terms of the internal dynamics of debate, the ones who put forward the bad arguments and were allowed to let them stand. That's a reflection of this obligation of self-administration. The other thing I guess I would point out is the whole system runs on presumptions, not on agreements. You don't need agreements in debate. All you have to do is have presumptions. And if you put forward something that is presumptively adequate and it isn't challenged, it stands. And it stands because of the obligation of self-administration. If you disagree with it, you got to say so. You got to point it out. If you think that it's bad, you got to point it out. Not somebody else. God doesn't do this for us. You got to do it. And all you need is this notion of presumptions. The other thing I guess I'd point out is the whole system runs on an obligation to clash. This is sometimes called the duty of debate. How's that differ? At least the way I understand it in debate from other people. It's not a right. It's an obligation. And it follows from the obligation of self-administration and the consequences of presumption. If you don't want to be bound by the consequences of a claim put forward, you've got to say so, which means you have to disagree if you don't want to go along. That's a duty. It's not just a right. And that, I think, is a slightly different vision of how good debate works. The other three obligations are all just corollaries of these first three. They follow from it and are simply different ways of wording it. The obligation to meet the burden of proof is simply the idea if a presumption exists, you've got to overcome it with good reason. The obligation to meet the burden of rebuttal is simply a way of saying once the presumption is shifted, it's now the burden of proof is now on you. And the obligation to meet the burden of extension is simply the idea that if you drop stuff, it doesn't stand anymore. And so you have to constantly keep in play and active any claims that you want to be. I guess I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacob. Very interesting talk. It doesn't seem that we have any questions at the moment on YouTube, so what I'm going to do is open the floor over here. I do remind everyone, please speak into your mic so that we can have it recorded. So if you need a mic, let me know. We can pass it around. So, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. It was a great talk, and it's very in line with our purposes. I really liked it a lot. But the question would be, when you talk about the obligation to clash, or when I was listening to you, I was thinking this is a kind of, let's say, one of the most important things to achieve democracy, and it's somehow related with the regime and all the American tradition, I think. The liberal tradition also at the same time. But what if, for instance, you try to implement this in a communitarian society? Yani, the obligation to clash, that you should stand out and say what is necessary to say. But think of other cultures that, for instance, yesterday, Imam Shafi was saying when you were explaining, like if the truth comes from the other party, he's more, it's better for Imam Shafi. Not, it's still maybe clashing. I don't know. We should discuss this, but there's a kind of culture here that we don't really most of the time, and so how? Yeah, just this is a question. I don't know the answer actually, but what would you say about this?
Implementing debate is costly. If you want to disagree with someone, there's a cost to it. And I think, is it back on? Okay, sorta. Weigh that cost differently. But the one thing that remains is if you don't disagree, you've got to go along. That's what the obligation to clash says. You can't escape that kind of obligation. It's existential. And it's just based on the way communication works.
Thank you once again, Scott. This was really thought-provoking. I'm going to try to stand in the skeptical side about one particular thing. So this logic of extension, which seems to underpin the whole idea of debating, you basically say it as claim, counterclaim, counterclaim, counter, until the point of exhaustion, which seems, when I hear it, wow, this is it. But then it feels like this assumes that every counter that we are going, as it were, one level down the argumentative, let's say, argumentative hierarchy of that particular reasoning. So because, so we are going more into the reasons. But when I see Obama and Clinton debating, I also feel like, well, it seems like they are just reframing, trying to frame their own positions once again and once again. Instead of always providing new counterclaims, they are more or less, you can say, what's going on is they are reframing. No, I don't let her frame what I'm doing, and I'm going to try to maintain my framing. So the counter claims maybe are not always, it seems to me, really following a certain extension of the argument. They are just trying to maintain a particular framing of their version. So you see the obvious problem here. There might be, so one, there is this problem. Second related question is that there might be a certain cutoff point where a jury could say, well, this is not extension anymore. The guy is just saying the same thing and insisting. How can one, if there is a way to do it, of course, it's not an easy thing, but how can we distinguish this extension from reiteration? So to say?
I think that there's... Thank you. I think there's something missing from the model that I've elaborated as far as it is. And you can see it really early on in the textbook tradition, and it continues to this day. I'd like to call it something like the burden of synthesis, but that isn't quite right, because part of what you're talking about is the need to go meta. And meta is getting off of this horizontal trajectory and sort of integrating the vertical and the horizontal, integrating the local last turn with where we started. That definitely needs to be put in. I don't have it because, frankly, I just can't formulate it right now. But that's part of the problem, I think, that you're pointing to. People go off in digressions. People get these big circular arguments. And at some point, what a good counter is you're just repeating yourself. This no longer answers the original point. I think that's perfectly compatible with the model, because it doesn't tell you anything about what a good counter argument is. Doesn't tell you anything about what a good argument is. That's all just sort of left up to us, and I'm satisfied with that because I know 14-year-olds, and I guess you guys even find younger kids can do this. I mean, they can at least implement the procedural rationality, even if, the logic isn't quite there. So I guess that's what I would say for how that goes. I would also point out that this ad infinitum problem is the boogeyman of all these models. I mean, think of critical question models that are quite popular. You can ask questions forever. Anybody who's had a little kid knows that. So, yep.
Thank you, Scott. I have a question that is a follow-up to Mali's.
Yeah. Is this working now? Oh, okay. Good.
So I was wondering if the comment he makes has to do with the move from the debate, academic debate conditions, or like this kind of tradition that involves a lot of charity and much less rhetoric, like you pointed out, where the students normally, or the debaters, when they study the cases in advance, they know the main arguments, they know, so there's less need for reformulation most of the time there, while in real life, when people debate, there's a lot of rhetoric involved and framing the stylistic devices, the way you present your case, it's part of, it's motivated basically by the need to win. So it's unavoidable in a real debate that people are going to always choose the formulation that puts their case in the best light, and that the opponent is going to try to challenge that. So in a sense, it's not an accident. It's by definition that the moment you move from the debate tradition the way it is to real life, you'll always fall. You'll always encounter that. So maybe if you would agree with that, the questions I would like to pose is even more general. To what extent can we benefit from these traditions for the real debates, do you think? Is it realistic to think that we can do something, we can achieve something by improving that for the practice of argumentation in real life?
Okay. Let's see, there are two ideas here. First, about reformulations. There's nothing wrong with reformulations. To come back after someone has an argument and say, what I meant was, I mean, that's a good thing, right? You hope that that happens in argument, because by the end you get a formulation that is the strongest formulation possible. As for application to real life, I'm glad Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were debaters. I wish more politicians would jump in and just say, I want to debate. I wish more people in the public were debaters and would sit there and enforce the requirement you didn't respond to the argument. I mean, if we just enforced that simple rule, you've got to respond to the argument, we'd be a heck of a lot better off. And I don't think you should expect from debate the solution to the abortion crisis, the war in Ukraine, or the Palestinian problem, Israeli problem. But I do think we could make progress on a lot of things if we just enforced this very simple set of requirements for good argumentation. I mean, they really are simple.
Thank you. So I'm interested in the obligation of self-administration. I'm not sure I understood it correctly. So the way I understood it sounds more like an intersubjective accountability. So we have to answer, okay. So here my question is this. It seems that a lot hangs on the type of individuals we have within the, involved. So a group of racists can do that and still be racist, even if arguments, anti-racist arguments are being there. One way to pose the question is, a responsiveness to the force of the better argument is something that doesn't seem to be much addressed. Yani, responsiveness is not merely addressing the argument of the other, but actually yourself being ready, let's say, to change your mind, to have the intellectual humility maybe, and mere exposure to different points of view does not give you that. It might be helpful, but it is insufficient on its own. So I wonder if there is something we need to do other than rely on the intersubjective accountability, or something like making sure that every party is at each point addressing the point of the other, etc. There seems to be something more today.
Yeah. I guess I have two ideas on that. One is there is no substitute for smart, well-informed, well-intentioned people. Okay, I mean, the model presupposes that. If you don't have them, dogs can't do this. Neither can 3-year-old kids. And neither can schizophrenics, for that matter. I know some personally, and they're not very good debaters. So that kind of competence is there. And if you don't have it, well, okay, everything goes haywire. We all know that. But built into the model is not just say something. This is not a model of first one person talks, then another person talks on the, sort of on the same topic. There's presumption shifting. The requirement is that when you put forward a claim, either that claim already enjoys the presumption and doesn't need justification, or if it does not enjoy the presumptive standing, you've got to justify it to the point that you claim the presumption. Now, the model doesn't tell you anything about what's good enough to do that. I don't know, take a class in experimental design. That'll help you a little bit, or one in causal modeling, tests and measures. That's what I always tell my students. I don't tell them to take a course in logic. I tell them to take courses in methodology. But you got to put forward arguments sufficient to overcome the presumption. It doesn't tell you how strong that presumptive resistance is. I mean, intuitively, it's going to take a lot more in the way of argument strength to prove that planet Earth is and has been for millions of years controlled by aliens from another planet than to show that, for example, the Russian-Ukrainian war is going to lead to a food crisis on the planet. Okay, doesn't tell you any of those sorts of things. That's the job of, I guess, logic broadly construed. But what it does do is it is a model of what is required to engage, to come to a conclusion in this sort of procedural sense.
Do we have any more questions? Go ahead, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you. I learned so much from this. I'm really especially interested in the 6 principles that you listed for the procedural adequacy principle. In the Adab al-Bath wal-Munazara, there are discussions about what ends a debate, and there's several things that are discussed, but the 2 main things in most of these traditions are in Arabic called ilzam, which is the questioner's inability to bring another critique at this point. And at that point, you're basically conceding to whatever the last rebuttal was, and the whole thing rolls back up and the argument's done. And the other one is called ifham, and that's the respondent's inability to continue to, it's the silencing of the respondent, meaning they can't come up with another supporting argument, or they have no more rebuttals against the objections. So you're done with that, and again, the questioner wins in this case. I see parallels in the 3rd procedural principle, the obligation to clash, with ilzam, which is the questioner's sort of compelled concession right?
Mhm.
Because if you don't, as you said, if you don't disagree, you have to go along. So, and I see a parallel to IFHAM, the respondents' inability to go on, right, with the principle number 6, which was the obligation to meet the burden of extension. As you said, if you drop stuff, it is no longer in play, right?
Right.
So I was wondering if because these are considered debate enders in the Munazara tradition, if you reach those points. If these are carefully monitored by the judge with a particular focus on the fulfillment of those principles 3 and 6, do you think that that might remove that forever boogeyman, as you called it, of the infinite argument? Because that
If it happens,
yeah.
right, the boogeyman is that never happens.
But
You just keep following up. I mean, there are meticulous debaters who really, don't have a whole lot to say, but they keep responding.
But
And
at some
that's the
point,
problem.
those responses become obviously spurious or
Well, I
non-constructive.
think that's the real interesting conceptual issue. Can you get to a point where the responses are so obviously not shifting the presumption
right.
that even though there's sounds coming out, we have no presumption shift? And yeah, the model just doesn't tell you that. I mean, that's the problem. And of course, the other problem is not all exhaustion is genuine exhaustion. The debate model is always tentative in its conclusions. I can say, that right now, this is who's won. But that doesn't mean that next week somebody isn't going to come up with answers to those arguments.
Okay, if we can have the last question from Rahmi.
But do you want to follow up?
No, just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, no, I'll say, yeah, I think you're exactly right on the parallels there.
So, and this is not just for this session, but I want to give this, put it out. You mentioned, through the ages, the debate manipulation and different designs happened in most of time there was a lot of intuition through the changes. So the question is, this is a question for all, for the Malaysian friends here, for the Qatari friends here, and for us as well. How can we design tests how can we design research in which we can test certain hypotheses? Maybe we have been debating about the time regulation, for instance. We have been debating about, should there be, as in the British parliamentary, should there be, let's say, should the opposition and the affirmation should be fighting with each other as well or not? These kinds of questions, can you give us insights? How can we design these experiments to test our hypothesis?
I'm a big fan of the Thomas Edison theory of social engineering, which is try it, see what happens. I mean, that's basically the history of debate. I mean, there are all kinds of missteps in the history of debate where people went, oh, that didn't work. And sometimes you find it out real fast. Sometimes it takes longer. It certainly takes a long time to invent techniques that help. For example, in modern debate, one of the big problems are squirrels. You guys talked about squirrels? Yeah, every debater's nightmare to come up against a squirrel. Critiques are another one. But they finally got a solution, which is you got to turn your affirmative case in 1 week before the debate. Nobody's going to be surprised anymore. In my classroom, I make them submit all their evidence to a common group folder. Nobody is surprised. Everybody in principle knows that's, but you got to think that stuff up, and then you got to see if it works.
All right, well, if that's all, thank you so much, Dr. Scott, and thank you everyone for your questions. So we'll end our keynote here. Yes, and we will have a 15-minute break. Thank you so much.